Really in a strong way this week as we continue to examine verse 3. And I promised you that we were going to discuss the Malbim's interpretation of verse 3, and we're going to go through it. He has a way of explaining and bringing out the significance of every single word here in verse 3 of chapter 1. And we're going to examine his explanations and his thoughts on these words. We'll also bring some other commentaries here and there, and of course I'm going to make my own suggestions because that's what I do. All right, so we're going to start with some questions. They're kind of basic. They're a little bit rhetorical, meaning leading us to the answers. But let's go for it. Let's reread verse 3. Okay? He shall be like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season and whose leaf does not wither. And all that he does shall prosper. So again, just to connect it, the two verses before were telling us of what is a fortunate person, how does a fortunate person behave? And first we started that he refrains from evil and from socializing in a context or in an environment which will have negative influences on him. And we said instead of doing engaging and being involved in those environments which will lead to sin, instead he busies himself with the commandments. He busies himself in his mind with thinking of the Torah. That's what he's busy with. So there's what he doesn't do, or he or she, or what the person does do. Now we're going to move on to another step, and we start with the word. In English it's he shall. In Hebrew it's vehaya. The word vehaya generally connotes the future, and it will be. Interestingly enough, the haya in modern Hebrew, haya, which is hey, yud, hey, is past tense. It means it was in the past. But in Tanakhic biblical Hebrew, the vav, the preceding letter vav, which in English means and, actually, and makes it mean the future, interestingly enough. For example, V'haya Hashem lamelech al kol haaretz. In the end of the Aleinu prayer, at the end of Jewish services, 3 times a day, the last sentence is, and God will be king over the entire earth. And the word is vehaya. It's referring to the future. He will be. So evidently, we're talking about the result. Person who behaves in the way we just described, he will be the following. He will be the following. Now, that vehaya will be, it could either refer to a form of compensation, his just reward, or it could refer to the process of what he develops into through his actions and conduct. And we'll see that the commentaries understood it in both ways. So it either is referring to who he becomes as a human being, or we're talking about way into the future, the ultimate spiritual reward, etc. Actually both of these things at the same time. And so, again, that's the he shall. He shall, v'haya, in the future he will be the such. Meaning to say, his conduct will result in the following. It's going to be like a tree planted. So the first thing is, why do we compare him to a tree? Why is this person compared to a tree? Well, clearly, we're trying to make a comparison due to the fact that a tree is a growing thing. Something that grows, develops. But grass and flowers also grow. So why a tree? And this is something the commentaries are going to address. Why a tree? Why not grass? In fact, grass grows a lot easier than a tree does. Grass grows all over. It covers, weeds cover everything. Trees is not so simple. A tree has to be, as the verse is going to continue, this tree is planted in a certain place. It takes a very long time to grow. So if we want to talk about prosperity, why don't we talk about grass? Why a tree? Now, let's take it further. It says, "V'haya ka'etz shasul al palgei mayim," and it'll be like a tree planted by streams of water. Now, this doesn't come out so much in the English, but the Hebrew word for planted is a little different. The word is shasul, or in Sephardic Hebrew, Israeli Hebrew, it's shatul. That's spelled shin, tav, vav, lamed. Shin, tav, vav, lamed. And it means something that is uprooted and it's really replanted. The tree here has been replanted. I'm not a big agriculturalist, but the idea is we take a baby tree and it's replanted in more fertile soil. It's first planted somewhere else, maybe in a greenhouse or something. It's replanted along the streams. So it's a replant. So it's not just it's planted, it's replanted. So why is the righteous person compared to a tree which has been replanted? That's the next question. And we go on to the next part of the verse. Al palgei mayim, the tree is planted, replanted, along streams of water. Why can't he just be planted in the earth like any tree? What's along the streams of water? What's the significance of that? Then it says it yields its fruits. What's the significance of it yields its fruits? Why didn't it just say it yields fruits? Why its fruits? It says it yields its fruits in its season. Why in its season? Why not all the time? Verse continues, whose leaf does not wither. Asher pio yiten bi'ito v'aleu lo yibol. And it's the ale is a leaf. Lo yibol will not wither. What's the significance of that? And finally, and all that he does shall prosper. So it's interesting. Now we're just leaving the metaphor. What is, and everything he does prosper. We kind of suddenly left the metaphor. We're talking about just generally whatever he does will succeed. Is it related to the tree? Is it talking about the tree? And what does the end of the verse mean? So before we get into the meat of the Malbim, I'm just going to quickly in passing mention that the Radak, one of the commentaries that you can find on Sefaria, he understands that a tree planted by waters refers to the fact that the tree always has its sustenance. It always has, the water that it needs. And he says that this refers to a righteous person who, no matter what happens to him, he's satisfied with his lot. That's the Radak. Just a simple, in other words, it's mental. It's not that he always has it in his needs, meaning to say that as the tree by the water, he always has an abundance in a physical sense, but it means relatively, meaning to say the person's perspective of his life is as if he always has, whatever he has is enough. He's happy and satisfied. That's the Radak. Now let's get into what the Malbim says. So the Malbim begins and he says that the verse is comparing a person, as I said before, to a tree, because basically what we're doing is we're emphasizing the growth aspect of a human being. And in that way, similar to a tree. Similar to the vegetative species of life that exists in the world. And he says, however, there's a significant difference between a tree and a human being. He says a human being is really an upside down tree. Upside down, that's what he says. Or you could say a tree is an upside down human being. Meaning what? Let's just think about the tree for a moment. The tree's roots are deep in the earth, right? The tree's branches are reaching out to the heavens. So think about symbolically in terms of a person. So he says the tree's nurture comes from the ground. All its nutrients coming from the ground. And its roots go deep, deep into the ground. It goes so deep The taller the tree, the deeper the roots are going, right? So he says the man is the opposite. He says man's roots are actually in his brain or in his head, meaning that's the main resting place for the soul. And it's deeply connected to the person's intellect and consciousness. So he says that the person's root is in the heavens, meaning in the spiritual reality. That's where a person's true root and sustenance comes from. And that's why his head is on the top of his body, not on the bottom. Because in other words, where you're more close to the heavens. A person's main sustenance comes from there. And he says, from the head, just like the roots of a tree, that sustenance, the emotions, vitality, that trickles down from the head to the rest of the body. This is also true, as we know scientifically, in terms of the nervous system comes from the brain and so on down to the rest of the body. But we're talking, I think, here particularly in a spiritual sense, where the person's vitality comes from his head. And in that way, so it's a tree. It's similar to a tree. Similar to a tree. So the tree is not an independent thing. Meaning to say its sustenance, it's not self-sufficient. It's getting its sustenance from somewhere. Person also gets its sustenance from its spiritual root. And primarily who the person really is his intellect and his spiritual being. So that's just eights. That's how a person is like a tree. That answers our first question. How is a person like a tree? That's how. He's like a tree, but he's not a tree. He has a similarity to a tree, but in actually the opposite, in a certain way, the opposite way. So now we ask the question, what about grass? Now, actually, the verse is going to continue in verse 4 of chapter 3. Is going to talk about how the wicked are like the chaff. Now, in other verses of Psalms, for example, if you look at chapter 37 of Psalms, refers to the wicked as grass. Refers to them as grass. Chapter 37, verse 2 says, for like grass, they will be swiftly cut down. Like green vegetation, they will wither. Okay, so evidently the wicked are compared to grass, and the righteous are compared to the trees. We see a similar comparison in chapter 92 of Psalms. In chapter 92, if you look at verse 8, it says, in the English, when the wicked thrive like grass and all evildoers flourish, it is in order that they may be destroyed forever. So again, a comparison to grass. And I think the comparison is straightforward. As we said before, grass grows up very quickly. And in a massive amount, like weeds, it comes up from everywhere. It grows easily and quickly, very quickly. However, what happens? After its season, it dies out. Then you need new grass to grow again. In the wintertime, it dies, and then there's new grass grows. However, the tree is different. The tree continues from year to year. It doesn't cease, even though there are periods of time. For instance, in in climates in the Northeast and all over where you have trees, it's seasonal. Sometimes they give fruit, sometimes they have leaves, sometimes they don't. But the tree remains, nevertheless, through the seasons. So we understand the comparison to the righteous person, that despite difficulties and despite continuous change, but the righteous person remains. As it says in the righteous person, sometimes he has to bow 7 times, but he gets up. There are difficulties and struggles, could be suffering, but he continues, he survives, and he continues. And there's this element of eternity and sustainability with the righteous. So, back to the Malbim. The Malbim explains, he says, the difference is that grass, it does grow quickly, this is very true, However, it lacks a certain individuality. It grows. It doesn't bear its own fruit. It's not really, doesn't sustain in any permanent way. But it has a seed, and then the next season there's more grass and more grass and more grass and more grass. So he says the difference between a righteous person or a person who's working on himself, his character and his fear of God, and other people, is that the other person, I mean, in his words, to be frank, he says the masses of people. He says the masses of people, they're mainly to continue the species. But you can look at it this way. He's talking about, you can look at it this way. Look at it in terms of a dimension of a type of a person. A person who works on himself, is concerned with himself spiritually, they develop a real self. If someone doesn't do that and they continue with their life without working on their character, without working on their relationship with God and growing, then in terms of their individuality as a person, they really haven't created anything. They have created one thing, though. They have offspring, and that's something that God seeks that mankind should continue. So like the grass, they grow, but their own, in terms of their own self as a person and as an individual, they lack significance. But the righteous person is like the tree. There's something there significant and productive in itself. As the verse is going to continue, it bears its own fruits, etc. So I think there's those dimensions in every person. The part of the person that's working on himself, if a person is working on his character and builds a relationship with God, then the individual is truly an individual. There's something truly of value that's been created there. If not, then you can almost say like, well, God is waiting for the next shot. You know, the person has children, mankind continue. Maybe the next generation will fulfill their purpose in life. This person didn't, but at least he had children and continued. So that's the idea of grass. So the righteous person is not grass. He isn't insignificant in himself. That's the opposite. He has a great significance and continues to bear fruit yearly and to create and be productive in a real way. While the grass does not. The grass just leaves over. It's a way to continue the species. So that's all ka'etz. That's all about the word, how a righteous person is like a tree. So what does it mean, shasul al palgei mayim? He's planted on the streams. Says that a righteous person is like someone who's been replanted. Now, he says, grass really can't be replanted. If you pick up grass and place it elsewhere, it's not going to be settled in properly. You know, I think usually when you have like, there isn't as much of this over here in New York, but, you know, people have gardens in front of their homes and you have a lawn. But the lawn comes with a little bit of earth with it. Comes with the roots and they place it down, right? But you don't just rip up grass just with the root without any soil in it. You know, there's something with it and you try and you replant it that way. So I think the idea of what he's saying is that just to pull up grass by the top roots and placing it down someplace else, it's not going to grow properly. However, the tree prospers and really thrives in that way. It's replanted elsewhere next to the streams and it thrives. So here, interestingly enough, the Malbim relates this part to the world to come in the future. And he says that's the difference, is the righteous person, he's going to be replanted, you know, in the world to come. This is part of the story is here. And then he's going to live in the world to come. And there he's going to be by the stream and give off fruits. In other words, there he's going to really prosper. So in other words, but the idea is he can be replanted. He's not just finished here. This isn't his only home. In fact, he's more home there than he is here. The wicked person, however, again, like the grass, very prosperous where he is. He's growing and growing and growing all over the place. But you try to place him elsewhere, he can't. He's finished. He dies off. And the same thing with the wicked person. Then he comments, but the tree is going, as we said, by the stream. What is the effect of the stream on the tree, and how does that compare to a righteous person? So he says an interesting thing. He says that what the stream does is it allows for the fruit of the tree to be consistent from year to year. Because as we know, weather is inconsistent. It can be a dry season. It can be a flood. It can be various things. So, but with the streams right there, every year in the proper season, this tree gives its best fruit every year without fail. So here he says something interesting. He says that the righteous person is different than the humanist. He refers to them in the parlance of his day as the philosophers. We don't, philosophers, you don't really hear that much about philosophers nowadays, but in the 19th century, I think philosophers were a lot more prominent. And he says that the philosophers, they get it right sometimes, and then other times they get it wrong, because it's human wisdom. And so they have some good ideas, but other ways they're really led astray in the wrong direction. And that's the idea that there's good seasons and bad seasons. However, the righteous person draws from the Torah. And with that, you never go wrong. Because when the wisdom is divine, then it's always correct. And it's coming from an objective place, not based on the person's subjective feelings, which people based on their own, different needs and egos and so on, and really just plain human error can make the wrong calculations. When it comes from divine wisdom, you're always on the right path. So that's by streams of water. The streams of water are the Torah, right? As the prophets refer to Torah as water, fits right in. Isaiah refers to the Torah as water. I don't have to tell you that we see this today very much so, that ideas that, some of them are very good, but they seem their excesses lead in really dangerous directions. I don't have to really elaborate, but we see a lot of ideas on both sides of the political spectrum that they just have excesses, and they go on into really areas that whether one group wants to go back to the past, another group wants to go to a utopian future that will never work, but they're both wrong. And the only really way to figure things out is through the Torah. The proper medium, the proper way to behave in every type of situation. They're different, through the Torah's wisdom, we can know how to react, when to be compassionate, when to be more disciplined, how to discern and have proper judgment. Okay, let's continue with the verse. He also says that also with Piryo yitain bito. What is Piryo? Its fruit. I asked the question before, what's the idea of its fruit? So he says that, once again, and this is very, very interesting. He says that the righteous person bestows his fruit as opposed to the philosophers. How so? And this is very, very interesting because he says that the fruit of the righteous person, which comes through the Torah, that is his fruit. However, ideas that people come up with, that's not necessarily, quote, their fruit. And what he says is that the ideas and the wisdom that the righteous person communicates and articulates from Torah come from his own soul, comes from his true spirit, his true divine identity. And so that's really his. That's really reflects who he is, as opposed to the philosophers where that's not the case. Where it doesn't really, because again, going back to the beginning, who is the person really? The person is really their spiritual self, their intellectual self. And a person's ideas get mixed up with their Freudian self, so to speak, the self that comes from different desires, different fears, different jealousies. That's not who the person really is. Underneath all the as we say in Jewish, the schmutz. I don't know if you know what schmutz is, but underneath the dirt, you uncover all that stuff, and then you get to the real person. And clearly, the Malbim is teaching us to look at ourselves this way. A person has to look at themselves, as we said many times, as being in the image of God. A person's real self is that part which bridges heaven and earth. The other part is it's things that we get, kind of little stains that we get on ourselves and so on. So sometimes that stuff can really cover a lot and kind of really bog us down. But the point is that we can dig through that. We can clean that up. We can get to the source. It may be a big job, but we can get there. So we're going back to who we really are. We're not creating something new. And that's Pirio. The righteous person bestows upon mankind and communicates who he deeply really is in the divine, his human side, his true humanity. Now, Be'ito is a similar idea that the fruit, he gives his fruit in its time. In its time, relates to the fact that the fruit, just like a fruit in its season, is at its tastiest. Similarly, we're talking about the fact that the fruit will be delicious, and in other words, it will be for the optimal enjoyment, or I should say, product, and have the optimal positive effect for mankind, as opposed to, again, something coming just from human invention. And then in the middle of this, he gets back to another point. What is Be'ito? In its time, he will bear fruit. And here he kind of switches back to the other meaning of us referring to compensation in the future and the time of the reward for the righteous. And he says, in his time, in the future, that's when he really, really will grow beautiful fruit in the future. It could be that the meaning of this, we're talking possibly in the Messianic era and even beyond, where there will be this revelation of God. And again, the souls of the righteous will really bloom in such an open way that the Torah that they will communicate and the secrets that they will know and communicate will be so great. That's Be'ito in that time. That's when we'll really, now it's the time of struggle and the exile. But in the future, the righteous will really see what they're all about in the future, because they'll be unencumbered by different struggles and just, I guess you could say, by the coarseness of the exile. And then we'll really hear what they have to say, God willing. Okay. Okay. Now, what is Valeu lo yibol? And his leaves will not wither. So he says, this is referring even to the possessions of the righteous, not just his spiritual produce and productivity, but even his physical possessions, because the leaves surround the fruit and protect the fruit. So the main objective is the fruit, is his spiritual productivity. However, he needs also physical things. So just like it says in the chapters of Shema in the Jewish prayer book, that it says there that V'hayim Shama Tishmu Mitzvotai, and it goes on to say that when you, Israel, when you listen and you follow my mitzvot and you love God, etc., then it says that Hashem says, I'll provide rain in its time, etc. So in other words, what it's saying is that if you focus on me, you worry about me, I'll worry about you. If you put your mind on the Torah and the mitzvot, I'll take care of you, your business. When a person's mind is always on how am I going to sustain myself, instead of spending his time thinking about the Torah and its commandments, then God says, okay, you have it, you're handling it, okay, I'll get busy with something else. But when a person busies himself with God's concerns, then God says, you're busy with my concerns, I'll take care of your concerns. I don't mean to say that a person doesn't have to work and do what needs to do in this world. However, nonetheless, there are limits. And a person shouldn't, for example, miss their set allotted times for Torah study, or compromise in their ethical and noahide responsibilities. They should know that whatever it is, Hashem will find a way to sustain them and provide for them. If they worry about what God wants first, He will worry about them first. And the same idea here. The main thing is the fruit. But even around the righteous, even his possessions, whatever he needs to sustain himself, his home, food, etc., Hashem will provide those things for him. And they won't, it will be sustainable. They won't dry out and wither. And everything that he creates will be successful. It's interesting, the word oseh here, oseh means to make. Ayin sin hey. Here it's ya'aseh's future tense. The yud refers to the future. What he does in the future will be successful. This is talking about his children, his offspring, says the Malbim. Whatever he makes, meaning to say the seeds of the tree, they will also be successful like he is, because they will learn from his ways and follow in his ways, and that creates a wonderful, wonderful positive pattern into the future. Okay, so that's the Malbim on this verse. This Malbim takes up most of the page here in his commentary. Now I'm going to make some of my suggestions about this verse. I want us to take a step back and think about the tree for a minute. Because in the Malbim, he's focusing on the roots. But we know scientifically that there's two sides to the sustenance of a tree, right? The roots of the tree are in the ground. The branches branch out up into the sky. And then it has its leaves, and then there's something called photosynthesis, right? So the tree is also being nurtured by sunlight, right? It's also true that, interestingly enough, the tree is reaching out in two directions. The tree reaches up to the heavens and also is digging deeper and deeper down into the earth. It's not just one way. It's going both ways. And the deeper it goes down, the more it's able to grow higher and in a sustainable way, right? Now, in Pirkei Avos, or in the Israeli Hebrew Pirkei Avot, if you look in the 3rd chapter, the 17th Mishnah states as follows. This is talking about a statement of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who says the following. He used to say, anyone whose wisdom exceeds his actions, to what is he likened? To a tree whose branches are numerous, but whose roots are few. Then the wind comes and uproots it and turns it upside down. Okay? So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah tells us that a person who has a lot of wisdom, but he doesn't have much action, he's compared to someone a tree which has many, many tall and long branches, but it doesn't have deep roots. So he says what happens is a strong wind comes along and knocks it over, and it's not sustainable. So we see a fascinating thing that according to the sages, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the roots refers to the mitzvot. Action according to Torah is the roots, right? Wisdom is the branches. So let's think about this, friend. This is very profound. So where does wisdom come from? Like the Malbim said, from the heavens, right? That's coming from the spiritual, from divine wisdom. So in a metaphorical sense, it's coming from the heavens above, because the heavens is less physical, less coarse, like the air. So in Judaism, it's used as a metaphor for the spiritual existence of life. However, doing the commandments, we got to get down and dirty. We got to work in this world. We have to actually get involved in physical things and help another human being, talk to another person, right? We have to, or with the planet, with the animal world, we have to, behave appropriately and really understand. We can't do that unless we really understand the world and understand people, right? Only then can we engage and do things right. So that means the roots are going deeper down. Giving charity. To give charity properly, you have to understand the person's problems. You have to understand where they're coming from in order to behave properly with them. So the roots have to go deep. And there have to be a lot of them. There has to be a lot of action. In order to sustain wisdom, divine wisdom and Torah, a person has to act upon it constantly. Take what he learned and apply it to their life. And then the wisdom becomes deeply rooted and it can't be knocked over by anything. In Hasidic thought, there are two main approaches to serving God. One is called Ratzo, one is called Shov. Ratzo means reaching up to the heavens and divesting oneself of worldly concerns. Person yearns to be close to God. Part of that yearning is a kind of a disregard for the physical life. Person blocks the physical world almost out of their mind. They're overwhelmed with God. They really just are in another world, They're in prayer. They're in the words of prayer, that God is infinite. He fills everything. He's way above. The angels say, holy, holy, holy. And there's just, the person is just in that space. He's in that zone. And, if you think about it, it's such a powerful thing, in the Jewish prayer. The idea of singing together with the angels, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. So you're really divesting from this world. You're placing yourself in the heavens, literally. You're thinking about the fact that we don't see it, but all the real forces of the world, they're singing God's praises constantly because he's so overwhelming. So that's called Ratzo. Person yearns to be close to God and really feels like, what am I doing here? I want to be latched on and cleaved to the source of life. The other part is called Shov. After a person goes through a period of that, for example, again, person prays the morning prayers, and then they come down back to earth. And now they are now engaged in mitzvot and the commandments in this world. That's the Shov. They influence others. So they're now, but think about it, they're now a different being, though. Now when the person comes down, you're coming down, but you're really kind of not the same person anymore. The point of that is that your journey up brings you down a different human being, and now you're not so, you're not so stuck in the mud, because your priorities are different. You've been in a space. You've mingled with the angels for a few minutes. And so when you come down, there's what's in Hebrew is called a roshem. A roshem. There's a residue, of that experience remains. And now you don't get so lost in this world. You remain more in control. And then you can engage in the mitzvot properly. You go around with that type of feeling, in the daily life and what you're doing in the world. So you have to have both. You have to have both. Not only that, but as we're saying, as a person then takes that feeling and acts upon it, person changes, the person's physical body is affected too. The person's physicality is affected, and they become stronger, and now they can go higher next time. So there's this relationship between like the tree, between the branches and the roots. In other words, the more energy the tree gets from the sun, the longer the roots can grow. The longer the roots can grow, the higher the branches can grow. So they're continually working together in the same way the person. The higher they go, they spend time prayer and Torah study, and they really keep that time sacred and get everything out of their mind just to do that. And they really dedicate themselves that I'm going to follow what I'm learning here. I'm going to try my best to do what it says here. And they meditate about God and his greatness. And then they come back into the world, and then they carry it out. They right away carry it out. They think, what did I learn today? What did I learn from the 7 mitzvot? Maybe another detail. Or I learned some lesson, ethical lesson from the Torah. How can I apply that to myself? How is that going to affect me in my life? Something comes about, an ethical question in life, and the person's first thought should be, what does the Torah say about this? Did I learn any story that could maybe shed some light on this conflict that I have, of what I should do? So that's taking the Ratzah, that's taking that force of fluttering to the heavens and applying it here down below. And that raises up the entire world. And when a tree's roots go deep into the ground, what does it do to the soil? It strengthens the soil. So too, when a person does the mitzvot and the commandments in the world, the whole world's changed. What happens if there's no tree there? You take the tree, what happens to the soil? It blows away. If there's no grass, if there's no, especially trees, what happens? The soil doesn't have, it becomes very loose, and just like what happened in the United States in the 1930s, you have a dust bowl. You have a dust bowl. Just the soil blows with the wind. Without vegetation, it blows away. So, and interestingly enough, so the commandments, not only is it that this tree grows so strong and it can grow higher, but the earth is affected also. Same idea with the mitzvot, is even the person's possessions, even the world around them and the people they encounter, everything becomes affected. I wanted to add there's another element here, which is that's discussed in Hasidic thought, and this has to do with the branches up, and that is there's something called serving God, which is called lamata lamala, which means from below to above, and there's something called lamala lamata, which means from above to below. What does this mean? Prayer is one, and Torah study is the other. From below to above is really what we just discussed, is reaching up towards the heavens. A person on his own strength reaches up and tries to divest himself of the world to a certain extent, to try to minimize the physicality and reach up to God. Lamala lamata is closer to Torah. What that means is there's a divine influence below. So in other words, and that's a little different. The person makes himself a vessel, and then he's divinely inspired. So do we see that in the tree? Yes, of course. The sunlight, the light is a metaphor of God's light. That's a divine light of Torah and holiness through Torah, primarily through Torah study, and also through the commandments, whereas the light shines on the person, so that the branches reach up. So the person does what they can, and like the leaves, creates a vessel to what? Accept it, in order that it can accept and soak in the light. But it also absorbs, it has to absorb the light. And that's also true with the person. It's also extremely important. We have to absorb the light. We have to make ourselves the vessels, meaning to say, open our minds, come with humility, and want to hear the lesson, and want to hear the wisdom. Really want to hear it. And then the sanctity will rest on us. And that's through primarily Torah study. And it can also come through the commandments.